Okay, so welcome everyone. You know how it is, you're trying to get a handle on a health issue, maybe reading online, and you just want the straightforward facts without wading through tons of medical jargon.
Exactly. And that's what we're aiming for today. We're doing a deep dive into nasal polyps. These are, well, non-cancerous growths in the nose, but they can cause a surprising amount of trouble for people.
Yeah, definitely. So our mission here is to sort of unpack what the medical literature says about the links between these polyps and, well, things like allergies, bacteria, even other conditions like asthma.
And what makes this really interesting, I think, is that the connections aren't always obvious. Sometimes the research seems a bit contradictory, actually, which makes it fun to dig into.
Absolutely. It's like piecing together a puzzle where the pieces don't always seem to fit at first glance. So let's kick off with a really common question. Allergies. Are they a major cause of nasal polyps? What did our sources show us? Because it wasn't simple.
No, not at all. What's intriguing right away is how wildly different the numbers are in different studies. Some research suggests, a really small overlap.
But how small?
Tiny, really. Maybe only 0.4% to 4.5% of people with allergic rhinitis also get nasal polyps, which is pretty similar to the rate in the general population.
Okay, so that makes you think, maybe allergies aren't a big deal for polyps.
Right. But then you look at other studies and the picture just flips completely.
How so?
Well, one study we looked at found nasal polyps in over 25.6% of allergy patients. Compare that to less than 4% in the control group without allergies.
Whoa, okay. That's a massive difference. So what's the takeaway then? Is it yes or no on the allergy link?
It's really not that simple. The fact that the numbers are so, all over the place probably tells us something important.
Like what?
Like maybe we're not talking about just one type of nasal polyp. Perhaps some are more linked to allergies and others, maybe not so much.
That makes sense. And you see that variation reflected when you look at it the other way too, right? Like how many people with polyps actually have allergies?
Exactly. Again, the numbers varied quite a bit in the sources. Some studies found as low as 10% of polyp patients had allergies, while others reported figures as high as 64%. Big range.
So the direct cause and effect with allergies seems fuzzy.
Fuzzy is a good word for it, yeah.
But what about IgE? That's the antibody we always hear about with allergies. Did the sources talk about its role?
They did, yeah. And it's definitely part of the picture. Many people with nasal polyps do show higher levels of IgE, immunoglobulin E, in their blood.
Okay.
And they often have positive skin tests to things like dust mites or pollen, common airborne allergens.
Right.
Plus, researchers have found a link between IgE levels, both the total amount and specific types, and the number of eosinophils. Those are the allergy-related white blood cells actually inside the polyp tissue itself.
So it sounds like the allergy markers are often there when polyps are present?
They often are, yes. And here's where it gets really interesting. It's not quite a direct line. The connection is more complex.
How so? What's the complication?
Well, it seems the amount of IgV floating around in your bloodstream doesn't perfectly predict what's happening locally, right there in the polyp tissue.
Okay. So your overall blood test for IgE might not tell the whole story about the inflammation in the polyp.
Exactly. The total serum IgE levels only seem to partially correlate with the IgE levels found in the tissue, and also with how much eosinophilic inflammation is actually there locally.
So something else might be going on specifically within the polyps themselves?
Precisely. And what's quite fascinating is that the IgE found inside the nasal polyps is often described as polyclonal.
Polyclonal? What does that mean in simple terms?
Think of it like it's being produced by lots of different immune cells right there in the nasal lining, not necessarily just driven by a specific external allergy trigger you might test positive for. And the really crucial insight, I think, is that this local IgE seems to be able to do its own thing. It can potentially trigger inflammation in the polyps, even if your standard blood tests or skin prick tests aren't showing strong allergies.
And wasn't there a recent finding about that? Something about mast cells that felt like a real aha moment?
Yes. That's a key piece. Recent work suggests this local mucosal polyclonal IgE can actually activate mast cells, another important immune cell involved in inflammation, and make them release those inflammatory chemicals independently of what your systemic serum IgE levels are doing.
Wow, so the polyps might be creating their own little inflammatory cycle, almost separate from a standard allergy.
It certainly points towards a more independent, localized IgE role in driving that polyp inflammation. It might not always follow the classic systemic allergy pathways we usually think about.
Okay, that definitely adds a layer of complexity. Now let's switch gears a bit. What about bacteria? That often comes up, this idea that bacteria might be involved.
Yeah, it's a long-standing suspicion, though the link is still considered, well, postulated, but not definitively proven across the board.
It makes sense though, right? I mean, our noses aren't sterile environments.
Not at all. They're teeming with bacteria. Research shows a really diverse mix in the nasal cavity. You've got aerobic bacteria, the oxygen-loving ones, and anaerobic ones that prefer no oxygen.
Any specific types mentioned often?
Oh yeah, lots. On the gram-negative side, things like Moraxella catarrhalis, Haemophilus influenza, Prevotella, Enterobacter, Pseudomonas species, and then gram-positive ones like various Streptococcus, coagulus-negative staph, and the big one, Staphylococcus aureus.
Staphylococcus aureus. That one seemed to get singled out quite a bit in the context of polyps, didn't it? Why Staph aureus specifically?
The main focus there is on certain strains of Staph aureus that can produce something called enterotoxins.
Enterotoxins. Okay.
Yeah, and the theory is that these specific toxins might play a role in actually making the polyp inflammation worse, maybe even driving the growth.
So how do these enterotoxins cause trouble? What do they do?
What's really key here is that these enterotoxins act as superantigens.
Superantigens. Okay, sounds powerful. How is that different from a regular antigen?
It's a massive difference in scale. So a normal antigen, like a piece of pollen or a regular bacterial protein, needs to be processed by your immune system, presented to T cells. And it usually activates only a tiny, tiny fraction of your T cells. Very specific response.
Right.
Superantigens, though, they kind of bypass some of that specific processing. They can directly link up immune cells and T cells in a way that activates a huge percentage of your T cell population all at once.
Whoa, like how huge are we talking?
Potentially up to 20% of the body's T cells can be activated by a single superantigen. Compare that to maybe 0.00001% to 0.0001% for a normal antigen.
20% versus 0.001%. That's an enormous difference. It's like flicking a light switch versus setting off a citywide alarm.
Exactly. That's a great analogy. You can see how that kind of widespread, non-specific immune activation could really stir things up and cause significant inflammation locally in the nasal passages.
Especially in someone who already has polyps or is prone to them.
Precisely. And in chronic rhinosinusitis with nasal polyps, or CRSwNP, this superantigen effect is thought to contribute directly to some of the key features we see.
Like what?
Like the increased eosinophilic inflammation we already talked about, and also the increased production of IgE antibodies locally. It's like the bacteria are pouring gasoline on an inflammatory fire.
So it might not be a direct infection causing the polyps from scratch necessarily, but maybe these bacterial products are amplifying the existing inflammation.
That's a very common way of thinking about it, yes. It's more about the inflammatory response to the bacteria or their products rather than the bacteria simply infecting the tissue.
Okay. And wasn't there also mention of biofilms? That sounds relevant here.
Yes, definitely. Bacterial biofilms are another important piece of this puzzle. These are basically structured communities of bacteria. They stick together and create this protective slime layer around themselves.
Like building a little fortress on the sinus lining?
That's a perfect way to picture it. And this fortress makes them much harder for our own immune system to clear out, and also much more resistant to antibiotics.
I can see how that would make chronic sinus issues, including polyps, really persistent.
Absolutely. And clinically, the presence of these biofilms in people with nasal polyps has been linked to, well, more severe disease and, unfortunately, sometimes worse results after surgery. They're just harder to get rid of.
Okay, so we've got this really complex picture emerging.
Yeah.
Maybe some allergy involvement, maybe some bacterial superantigens or biofilms stirring the pot. How does this all connect to other health conditions? Do polyps often show up alongside other issues?
They certainly do. When you zoom out and look at the bigger health picture, you definitely see patterns. For instance, CRSwNP is noticeably more common in people with asthma.
Oh, much more common.
The sources suggest around 7% of asthma patients have it, compared to maybe 4% in the general population. So nearly double the rate.
Okay, that's significant.
And the link gets even stronger if you look at a specific group. People with something called aspirin-exacerbated respiratory disease, or AER.
AR, right? Aspirin sensitivity plus asthma and polyps.
Exactly. In that group, the prevalence of nasal polyps is incredibly high. Estimates range from 30% up to 60%.
30 to 60%. Wow. That overlap really screams shared underlying problem, doesn't it?
It strongly suggests these conditions aren't just happening coincidentally. There's likely some shared biology or pathway involved.
Any other potential factors mentioned?
Well, chronic inflammation in general is often cited, and a condition called allergic fungal sinusitis is another potential risk factor or association.
Fungal sinusitis, okay.
And there's also a growing interest in genetics. Some research suggests certain genetic variations might make people more susceptible to developing chronic rhinosinusitis in the first place, which could then, pave the way for polyps.
It really paints a picture of interconnectedness, doesn't it? It's not just about the nose.
Not at all. And that brings us nicely to the link between the upper and lower airways, particularly the connection with asthma, which the sources really emphasized.
Yeah, that seemed like a major theme, the whole united airway concept.
Exactly. It's been recognized for a long time that the upper airways, like your nose and sinuses, and the lower airways, your lungs, are closely linked. I mean, they're even lined with basically the same type of tissue that pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium.
Fancy name. But basically similar plumbing.
Similar plumbing, similar lining, and the statistics really bear out this connection when it comes to polyps and asthma.
What kind of numbers did we see there?
Pretty high prevalence of asthma in nasal polyp patients. Depending on the study, somewhere between 30% and maybe even up to 71% of people with polyps also have asthma.
30 to 70%, that's a huge proportion.
It really is, and it's not just about having asthma. The severity seems important too, right?
Yes, that came through clearly. There seems to be a direct association. The more severe someone's asthma is, the more likely they are to also have nasal polyps.
It suggests a shared level of inflammation or reactivity, perhaps.
The timing also seemed interesting. When do polyps tend to pop up relative to asthma?
Yeah, the timelines are quite revealing. For people who develop asthma later in life, not childhood asthma, but adult onset, maybe 10% to 15% of them will go on to develop nasal polyps.
Okay. And when does that typically happen?
Usually it takes a while.
Yeah.
The sources suggested typically around 9 to 13 years after the asthma first started. It points to a sort of gradual process or progression.
9 to 13 years. That's quite a lag.
It is. But compare that to aspirin-induced asthma, that AERD group again.
Right. What happens there?
It's much faster. In those individuals, nasal polyps often appear much sooner after the asthma symptoms begin, maybe only around 2 years later, on average.
Only 2 years. That's way quicker.
Yeah.
What does that speed difference suggest?
It really hints that the underlying mechanism linking asthma and polyps might be particularly strong or direct in that specific AERD condition.
And biologically, when you look under the microscope, so to speak, at asthma and polyps, are there similarities?
Oh, absolutely. There are striking overlaps in the underlying pathology.
Like what specifically?
You see many of the same features. Lots of those eosinophils we keep mentioning. Mucus-producing cells working overtime, causing hyperplasia, tissue swelling or edema, a thickening of the structural layer called the basal membrane.
So similar cellular and structural changes.
Yes, and also similar chemical environments. Both conditions often show increased levels of key pro-inflammatory mediators, like cysteine leukotrienes, for example.
So those are targets for some asthma and allergy meds, right?
Exactly. The fact that you see them elevated in both conditions reinforces this idea of shared inflammatory pathways operating across both the upper and lower airways. It's like the same inflammatory process is manifesting in slightly different ways in the nose versus the lungs.
That makes a lot of sense. It's like they're partners in crime, inflammation-wise.
That's a good way to put it. And maybe the most convincing evidence for this partnership is what happens when you treat one part.
What do you mean?
Well, studies have observed that when you effectively treat the nasal polyps, whether with medication or surgery, patients often experience a noticeable improvement in their asthma symptoms, their lower airway disease. So fixing the nose helps the lungs. It suggests a definite two-way street, supporting that whole upper-lower airway connection very strongly.
Okay, so let's try to wrap this up. We've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive. What's the main takeaway message about nasal polyps and their connections?
I think the biggest takeaway is simply, it's complex. The relationships between allergies, bacteria like Staph aureus, other conditions like asthma, and the development of nasal polyps. It's not a simple A causes B situation.
Right, it's more like a web of interacting factors.
Exactly, a really intricate web. And researchers are still actively working to map it all out and understand all the connections. We shouldn't expect easy, definitive answers just yet.
And we definitely saw that reflected in the sometimes contradictory findings we discussed. It's fascinating, but also highlights how much we're still learning.
Absolutely. The science is constantly evolving here.
So thinking about all these connections, the immune system acting locally, the potential bacterial triggers, the strong link with asthma, it really makes you wonder, doesn't it?
Wonder what?
Well, what other health conditions that seem totally unrelated on the surface might actually have these kinds of hidden underlying connections? If the nose and lungs are so tightly linked, what else might be connected in ways we haven't fully appreciated yet?
That's a really provocative thought. It definitely encourages you to think about health more holistically, doesn't it? Considering how these complex biological systems might interact across the whole body.
Yeah, something for all of us to keep in mind as we try to understand our own health and the information we come across.
It certainly is. And it really underscores why continuing this kind of research and having these kinds of discussions is so important.